All the punishments in Torah describe the sin, not necessarily the sinner.
It doesn't seem like there's a lot of punishment these days in our lifetime. A lot of sin, but doesn't seem like there is a lot of punishment. So this is actually the topic that I would love to speak with you today about, and to get a clearer idea of what exactly reward and punishment is in accordance to Torah.
Well, one thing is for sure, we're not praying for punishment. Never. But let's examine the subject, the way it's presented in the Torah. Every action has a consequence, because the actions are significant. So if you do a mitzvah, that's a significant, powerful act, and it's going to have consequence. It's going to create reverberations. If you do a sin, that's a serious act. The sin has negative substance, so it's going to create a disturbance. That's understood. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So at first, we could say every sin has a reward, has a punishment, and every mitzvah has a reward. It's the natural consequence. It's not God handing out gifts, or God getting frustrated and taking revenge. The consequence of your sin is negative. The consequence of your mitzvah is positive. That's what we call reward or punishment. We're told that the punishment is always commensurate with the sin. Like if you sin in speech, somehow you'll get punished through speech. If you sin with your eyes, you'll get punished somehow by, it will always match. So the obvious question, we'll get this out of the way immediately. Every punishment matches a sin. So the punishment of the Holocaust, what sin does that match? No, it doesn't. There is no such sin. Jews did not go out to murder millions of people. So the Holocaust was not a punishment. Not even the consequence of our sins. It's a total mystery, and only God someday will explain it. But until then, unacceptable. So, not every pain is punishment. Every punishment is pain. But not every pain is punishment. That's not a logical conclusion. Like, for example, the exile in Egypt, 210 years. For which sin? We hadn't even been given the Torah yet. So there was no sin, and it was not a punishment. But when there is punishment, it must match and be commensurate to the sin. Person sins unintentionally, the punishment is a sacrifice, tshuva. Person sins intentionally, it's a whole different thing. So when the Torah says, for example, if you eat chametz on Pesach, punishable by death. So everybody who eats chametz on Pesach dies? Obviously not. Why not? Well, for two reasons. First of all, only if you sin intentionally does the punishment apply. What does it mean to sin intentionally? You have to know what sin is. You have to know what God is. If you know God and you know what the sin is and you do it anyway, then there's a punishment, because you're a destructive force. But if you're doing it out of ignorance, if you're doing it unintentionally, if you do it accidentally, of course there's no punishment. That's number one. Number two, this sin carries a death penalty, let's say. But then there are mitzvahs that bring you long life. So what does God do if a person sins and is deserving of death, but he also did a mitzvah that is deserving of life? Now he's stuck. He doesn't know what to do. So you would think the person should die immediately and then be brought back to life, because you don't get punished for every individual sin. You get rewarded or punished by the weight of the good versus the bad in your life. So if you did 100 mitzvahs and one sin, you get rewarded because the good outweighs the bad. It could be, for example, that a person did 100 sins, but he did one magnificent mitzvah that outweighs the 100 sins. So who can judge these things? Who could know these things? That's why we are not allowed to judge. The Tanya says, you should feel inferior to every person you meet. And it has to be sincere and real. How is that possible? I know I'm a very observant, orthodox, religious, frum Jew. I do everything right. And I meet a guy who does nothing right. I'm supposed to feel inferior to him? How does that make sense? So most people say, well, you fake it. Act like you're inferior, even though you know you're far superior. That's not true. That's not kosher. That's not what the Torah is about. There is no make-believe. So when the Torah says you should feel inferior, it means you have reason to feel inferior. What is the reason? So the Rebbe says, you're looking at a guy who is sinful, and you look down at him. Bad. Don't sin. You shouldn't have sinned. Stop sinning. What would it take for this person to stop sinning? He is so exposed. He is so vulnerable. He is so uneducated, unprepared for this battle. And yet, if he doesn't put in a battle, and if he doesn't struggle to not sin despite all the temptation, you call him a loser. Have you ever put in an effort not to sin? To you, it came easy. You were raised properly. You live in an environment where people don't do these things, so you don't do it. But the one sin that you are guilty of, how hard do you try not to do it? Let's say you'll never violate Shabbos, you'll never eat anything not kosher, you keep every holiday, etc., 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 but you like to talk negative about people. That's your weakness, that's your sin. How hard do you struggle? How much effort do you invest in not doing that? So it turns out that the guy who sins, like by committing adultery, is condemned for not trying harder to resist the temptation. But you don't try harder, so who are you to judge him? When it comes to your weakness, your temptation, you don't work so hard. So a person can say, well, that's true, but look at the difference in the sin. He's committing adultery. I'm just gossiping. How can you compare? True. The sins are not comparable, but we're not talking about which is a bigger sin. We're talking about who's a better person. When it comes to being a mensch, you're the same. He doesn't struggle, you don't struggle. So don't feel superior. Then the Rebbe says, okay, you got me. We're equal. But you told me to feel inferior. How am I inferior? The answer is, you know. You were privileged. You were given a Jewish education. So you are closer to God than the guy you're judging. If you're closer, then your lack of effort is more offensive. You've studied, you've been taught, you've been inspired, you're surrounded by holiness, and you still can't make an effort. Whereas the other guy, true, he doesn't make an effort, but you can hardly blame him. So you're inferior because you've learned more, because you know more. Your sin could be considered an intentional sin. The guy you're judging, his sin is unintentional. It's out of ignorance. It's out of assimilation. He was never taught. So how do we judge people? How do we know who deserves what? Just by looking at the list of sins that are punishable by death? The sin is punishable, but not the person. Because although he committed that sin, he committed it unintentionally. Or he also did 100 mitzvahs to balance it. So when we read in the Torah, this sin is punishable by this punishment, that's the sin. It doesn't mean every person who does that will receive that punishment. Because a person is more than one sin. And so it is so wrong, inaccurate, against the Torah to say, oh, you see that person? He deserves to die. Yes, that's what it says. No, it doesn't say he deserves. The sin is that kind of sin. Now, it's very much like a medicine. Modern medicines. They produce medicines and they find out that they make people sick or actually kill people. And they have to withdraw it, take it off the shelves. So what happened there? Well, it worked on rats. Doesn't mean it's going to work on humans. It works on diseased tissue, but you can't give it to a living person. So, yes, this medicine kills bacteria. It kills bacteria, not people. If it kills people, it's not a medicine. So that needs to be understood, that all the punishments in Torah describe the sin, not necessarily the sinner.
It always has been that people understand reward and punishment as karma, which is sort of what we're talking about. Not exactly, but okay, if something bad happens to somebody, they start to reevaluate what have they done wrong recently in order to deserve whatever has happened to them. So is this completely wrong? This is not at all reward and punishment that God has intended?
Absolutely. But there's a difference between others, when you're judging others, or you're judging yourself. A person finds that he's suffering from whatever, God forbid, And he says, it's probably because of my sin. That's wonderful. Whether it's correct or not is irrelevant. Because if you say it's because of my sin, then you're going to improve your behavior. You're going to become a better person. So whether it's true, accurate or not, doesn't matter. It's a good thing. You're at least getting some moral improvement out of the pain. So you're using the pain positively. So if a person says for himself, I probably deserve this pain for my sins, that's very positive. It's very noble. But if you say that about somebody else, what are you doing? Where's the benefit to that? Rambam says, not as a theory, but as a ruling, a halacha, the person who does mitzvahs because he wants to go to heaven or whatever reward, and he avoids doing sin because he doesn't want to go to hell or whatever punishment, is not doing it right. That's not the appropriate way. That is used to educate children, ignorant people, unlearned people. You tell them there's a punishment, but that's only temporary until they learn, until they get to know what godliness is, what their soul is all about, what their mission is all about. Then they have to switch. So it's an interesting question. If you're talking to a child or to a person who has a hard time studying, he's just not intellectually gifted, then you use the reward and punishment approach. When do you switch? Or better yet, a person who has never learned anything, but he's a very educated person. He's never learned Judaism. But you're not talking about a child, you're talking about an adult. And you're not talking about a person who has a hard time understanding. He's a genius in everything else. How do you approach this person? Do you start with the reward and punishment? Or does he not fit that category? A person who is intelligent, you don't treat him like a child. So even though he has not yet learned, but he is an intelligent, active mind. And so you tell him the truth in the first place. You don't go with the reward and punishment. That's the ruling of the Rambam. So it's not open to debate anymore. That's the right way to teach people and to inspire people. So again, why do we need to know about reward and punishment? Only as a childhood teaching method? No, can't be. The reward and the punishment are a vivid description of the nature of the sin. What is it about this sin that deserves a whipping? And the other sin deserves death penalty. And the third one deserves a fine. How does that happen? How does God choose the different punishments for the different sins? So when you're told, this sin, whoever sins will be cut off from his people, he will die. What is it about this sin? So the punishment is simply another detail in understanding the nature of this particular sin. Or the mitzvah. For this mitzvah you will be rewarded both in this world and in the world to come. Oh, what is it about this mitzvah? So it's not meant to be our reason for doing or not doing. It's a little more information about the mitzvah or about the sin. So every mitzvah has commentary. You eat matzah on Pesach, how much matzah? When do you eat it? Before the bitter herbs or after the bitter herb? What blessing do you make on it? How do you make matzah? What makes matzah kosher for Pesach? So there's a lot of information about the mitzvah. One piece of information is how much godliness does it produce? Or what is the reward? Do it for the reward? No. The reward is a detail. You don't do it for the detail, you do it for the mitzvah. But it helps to know that this mitzvah is special in this way. It carries this reward. Or this sin is different, it carries a different punishment.
Speaking of good news, there's a wonderful retreat coming up, the National Jewish Retreat, run by the JLI, Jewish Learning Institute. It's going to be August 9th through the 14th in the Miami area, in a 5-star hotel, best speakers, best lectures, best classes, best accommodations, and best food. So if you have those 5 days free, or any one of those 5 days free, think about joining us. It's going to be great for body and soul. And there's actually a discount if you put my initials in there, RMF. There's a little discount for those who are already committed, already studying, already interested. Google it, look it up, Jewish Retreat, JLI. And hopefully we'll see you there. If you enjoyed this conversation or this topic, and you're looking for more information, or you want to hear it again from another angle, there's a way to do that. And that is in this book. It's all there. Order it from Amazon. You can read it, reread it, and share it. I want to invite you to join us as VIPs, partners in our work, and join us also for a personal chat with other members of the VIP club. We talk about many things. There's an opportunity to ask, to respond, to make a comment, to meet the other supporters. And together we can really make a difference in Jewish life and in life in general. So join us. It's goodtoknow.org. Log in, call, make contact, and join us with the VIPs.